This is a critique of simulation theory from the Christian perspective, though it's also a critique of the current state of Christianity from the perspective of simulation theory. And maybe I'll actually start with that. The real blind spot for contemporary Christian theology, and by contemporary I guess I really mean like modern and contemporary, like since the scientific revolution, Christian theology has had no idea what to do with science. Like there just are not, it can't engage with science, and it seems like it would be better to have theologians really learn math and science and then incorporate philosophy of science and philosophy of mathematics into their theological cosmogonical picture, of how did God create the world? Maybe mathematical physics and logic and experimental computation are actually helping us find out how God created the world. But now, of course, there are theologians who, there's people like Teilhard who know math and science, but actually Teilhard's not a very good example of my critique. He's actually kind of aligned with the views that I have, I guess. But anyway, but he's not a theologian, really, So there aren't theologians who are incorporating math and science into their theologies, even if they also maybe have expertise in those fields. So, simulation theory, for those who don't know, I feel like that's kind of been becoming a buzzword in the past couple of years, is the idea that basically that we live in the Matrix, that the physical universe isn't actually real, that it's a computer program, and maybe outside of it is actual reality, or maybe that thing is a program too, and in theory maybe there's a base reality somewhere, but that the universe is basically a kind of cosmic game, and that that general idea is certainly not crazy, and then specifically, there's a lot of interesting seeming potential evidence of this stuff, like look at the work of Stephen Wolfram and his work in cellular automata, and especially the game of life. So with the game of life, basically, if you have a certain simple program, and this is a phenomenon you can observe, that like certain simple programs will create just nothingness or oscillations or noise or whatever, and then every once in a while one will happen to create a little sort of world of pixels, where objects have consistency and move around and seem to interact with one another and can create and destroy one another. And you could write formulas that would be like the physical laws of that universe, that would be accurate based on your observations of what's happening. But what you wouldn't know is that what really explains all that stuff is not those physical laws at all. They do describe it accurately, but what explains it is that there's an underlying code, an underlying program, which really cannot be known from the perspective of that that little universe. So you can, that's something that is very easy to produce with like a very simple computer. And but you can imagine scaling that up and imagining that we are little objects, just like the objects in that more simple version, and that that mathematical physics is learning all these things about the world, but that there's a whole other level of description that we either just don't have access to, or we will only ultimately have access to through computer science somehow. That what really governs the world is not physical laws at all. Those just describe the world, that the world isn't inherently physical, that it's actually structural. And you can use the term structural realism to define that basic orientation. There's different versions of it. Tegmark is another kind of popularizer of it, and he has a different view of how this all works. So I guess my issue, I think, with this view is that it just like Christian theology ought to have a closer relationship to math and science and computer science, the kind of metaphysical outlook that this generates, that people usually talk about it in terms of, is not informed by theology. And there's something that ends up being kind of trivializing, like, oh, maybe there's some alien who's creating or simulating us or whatever. But if that's God, then theology has a whole. If that's God, it's not a very reverent way to talk about it. And it's not just a matter of aesthetics, because according to theology, there are practices of speculation and of meditation, and there are traditions of revelation, or revelations within the Christian tradition, that give us insights about the nature of God and of God's relationship to humanity. And those should, I was going to say, be incorporated into any simulation theory, but really those should dominate it. Simulation theory should be incorporated into that. Just one example of this is the classic sort of double negation, I guess, of Pseudo-Dionysius, who is a hugely influential theologian from very long ago, who makes the case that God seems in some ways to be analogical to humans, right? That we have an idea of goodness, and that involves a certain kind of satisfaction, or pleasure, or beautiful form, or however you want to define that. And that from the perspective of God, or as God's nature, God has some kind of goodness too. We know something kind of about God through our idea of goodness, but that the analogy breaks down, that God's goodness is actually incomprehensible to us. And this is kind of a paradoxical view, but I think it sort of has to be ultimately, it only makes sense when it's complemented with the mystical insight of some kind. It's beyond words of what God's goodness is. And the same relationship holds for God's creation of the world, and the world's unfolding, and God's interventions into the world, through Jesus and through angels and miracles uh, in its comparison to something like simulation theory, is that we don't really know what we're talking about, but the analogies are worth exploring. So the last thing I'll say on this is like that. I think that the correct metaphysical conception, where there are four alimonies, there are four layers of reality, is analogous to the layers of what a game is. Like that there's a real connection there. That like Sem is the game as it's being played. It's an actual instance of the game, where there's contingency, and there are interacting beings, and there's stuff at stake, and so forth. And that's the lowest metaphysical level. And then the metaphysical level above that is the architecture of the game, which is more eternal and less contingent than an instance of the game, but where it has kind of classes in it, and it has all this programming in it, right? The actual code of the game is something like the underlying world that's actually the actual sort of structural existence of society in its contingency, and then above that there is the world of code, like as such, basically, or like the language, the language that the game is created using. The logos. In the beginning was the word. And then above that is some kind of space of like pure possibility, which is also some aspect of God, and that there's some kind of will or subjectivity that really cares how things are going. So I mean, that analogy is really useful, and I think it does put things in the right order. Like it does. It's not materialist, which is just completely stupid, and it's not idealist either, where there's not an impersonal eidetic process that's just unfolding. That at the top there's somebody who cares. But the analogy is very thin as well. Like it's a correct orientation, but at each of those levels, I think I can tell you for sure that things interpenetrate much more than we can conceive of them doing. And that there is more freedom running through the whole thing. And yeah, so I mean, just generally speaking, I think that the Christian view and its sort of refusal of all kinds of heresies like Gnosticism and Neoplatonism, especially those two, not Gnosticism and Neoplatonism, and other forms of sort of monism and of course materialism, that is still on the right track, and there should be a space open for revelation, for ongoing revelation, and for tradition and authority. The first couple ecumenical councils of the church, I think, generated something that is still true, as well as Christ's message. And that really needs to be in there, because if you're just like a tech bro or something who doesn't know the history of philosophy, or the nature of religion, or the history of religion, you end up collapsing into some something that is actually Neoplatonism or Gnosticism or monism or materialism or something, that you're, um, and that's just, you're not seeing as much of the truth as you could be seeing. And I think there's less access to the spiritual realization that could be possible, or a sort of useful attitude towards life and society as the world continues to evolve in the way that it's evolving. So that's something that I don't really see that being said very much, and like it's tying together things that there's always just these silos, that are, each silo has some little bit of truth in it that's so valuable, and it's kind of surrounded by kind of prejudice or confusion or ignorance that keeps it functioning for the sake of the armistice of a reason, which is ultimately not beneficial to humans, I think. And if we can kind of connect them and connect the truths that they all have to offer, that's what's beneficial to the armistice of Heiligen, where people can be fully realized and it can be fully egalitarian and so forth.